Plant domestication is the process by which humans transform certain species of edible wild plants to become more productive and better suited to the needs of humans for agriculture. Many of these are plants that we still use today, ones that you are familiar with and know and love to eat, like corn. So here on the left we have the wild ancestor of corn, Teosinte, and then next to it a variety of corn that is very similar to early domesticated varieties of corn. But not all plants that were domesticated still remain part of our food systems. On the right is something that looks a lot like sunflower seeds, but it's a plant called marsh elder that was domesticated in the eastern United States before corn, which had been domesticated further south in Mexico, was introduced. Humans transformed this plant, making the seeds larger and more productive per plant, producing more food per acre. You can also see that in the transformation from Teosinte to corn. Rather than 2 rows of kernels along a central stalk, the domesticated corn has 8 rows that rotate around it. And this is one of the defining characteristics of plant domestication, making the plant more productive. So what do you think all of these vegetables have in common? Cabbage, cauliflower, kohlrabi, Brussels sprouts, broccoli, kale. Now admittedly they're all kind of yucky, but that's not what I have in mind. They are all plants that have been domesticated from a single species of wild plant. Selective breeding by people has enhanced different aspects of the plant, parts of the plant that people want to consume. So cabbage emphasized the terminal bud of the plant to make one large giant bud at the expense of the rest of the plant, whereas Brussels sprouts, which look like little tiny cabbages, emphasize the lateral buds going up along the sides of the stems. Cauliflower emphasized the flower growth, broccoli the stems and flower, kohlrabi the stems, and kale the leaves. And kale most closely resembles the wild species from which all of these were domesticated. They were transformed by selective breeding by people in order to create ones that better suited people's needs for consumption. Domestication is the intervention by people in the life cycle of a useful plant or animal species, which leads to morphological change in the size or shape of the newly domesticated species in order to meet the needs of people. Some domesticated species become dependent upon people for propagation. Many domesticated plants lose their ability to self-disperse their seeds and require humans to plant them in order to have another generation of the plant. Domestication occurred independently in many different places in the world, and many of the plants that we consume today were domesticated in the Old World, but several really important species of plants were domesticated here in the New World, including corn, beans, potatoes, sweet potatoes, cotton, peanuts, chili peppers, lots of important ones, especially that last one. Who wants bland food? We want spicy chili peppers. Plant domestication is an evolutionary process where the actions of people are a selective agent in the evolution of a plant species that is exploited as food. Over a long period of time, people's foraging behavior will begin to alter the exploited plant species so as to place certain members of a population of that plant at a competitive advantage over other members of the population. Certain morphological traits that they have that are more attractive to people, since people act as a dispersal agent for the plant seeds. And plant evolution is often guided by the desire to attract other animals to help the plant disperse its seeds. Two ways that plants are transformed by human selective pressures is the increase in infructescence, where they grow larger seeds, seed heads with more larger seeds within them, or larger fruits that contain those seeds. Another process is a decrease in dehiscence, where the plants become less likely to self-disperse their seeds and rather contain the seeds upon the plant where they are gathered by people. In this photo we can see the difference between wild beans and the way that they self-disperse their seeds versus domesticated beans. So on the left and in the middle are wild beans, and as the pod dries and the seeds within mature, it splits open, and in the case on the left, the halves of the pod coil in order to force the seeds to be dispersed away from the plant and onto the ground where they can work their way into the soil and sprout to become the next generation of plants. In contrast, the domesticated variety on the right, the pod doesn't split and open. It shrinks down and contains all of the beans. It's like a shrink-wrapped package holding the beans together on the plant to be gathered by people, because the last thing people want to do is get down on their hands and knees and sort through the dirt for the beans beneath the bush. It is much handier and easier to grab those that are remaining on, shrink-wrapped for your convenience. The evolutionary process of plant domestication takes place in the context of two interdependent historical processes. On the one hand, there is the plant genome, which is affected by processes of mutation and recombination. Mutation, where occasionally different varieties can arise, almost by accident within the genetic code. Usually most mutations are deleterious, bad, and are not passed on to the next generation, but sometimes there are advantageous mutations. Domesticated corn takes advantage of a natural mutation where the 2-row teosinte was transformed into 4-row through a mutation. Recombination is when genes from the mother and father plant, the plant that provides the pollen and the plant that provides the ovum, mix together and pass on a combination of their genes to the next generation. So desirable characteristics from one plant can be passed on to another plant. And this was also used in the domestication of corn, where these 4-by mutations were crossbred together to create 8-row corn, the earliest true corn. The second independent historical process is culturally determined subsistence behaviors, how people are going out into the landscape and using these plants, and as human use of these plants became more intense, they began to transform the plant populations even more. And this could happen very rapidly because these are annual plants. They have a new generation the next year, so change can evolve and be expressed very quickly within many plant species. The beginnings of plant domestication did not require any intentional actions of people. It's not like someone woke up and was like, I think I'm going to go out today and domesticate some plants and make the seeds bigger. But it was something that occurred gradually and almost accidentally, unintentionally. But at some point, a light went on over someone's head, and it probably wasn't just one person in one place, because domestication occurred independently in many different areas. The same context of intensified interaction between human populations and a plant population began to transform those plants. But people then recognized this transformation, and they began to do things like store seeds over the winter, not just for consumption, but to plant them again in the spring. Intentional planting, clearing areas in order to plant them, and then also beginning to deliberately select for particular attributes, larger seeds, larger fruits, more productivity, better adapted to different conditions, higher elevations, more or less water, what we call selective breeding. So why do archaeologists study domestication? The domestication of plants and animals didn't just transform these plant and animal species, it had great effects on human societies. It allowed for greater sedentism. People began to settle down and live in the same place because once you've planted crops, you need to stay nearby to tend them. It provided greater assurances against dietary uncertainty. You had a ability to predict to some degree the amount that you would harvest each year based upon what you planted. It helped foster population growth with this greater productivity, and it led to the development of social complexity, because domesticated plants are more productive per acre than any wild plants, allowing greater amounts of food to be produced, and a single farmer can produce more food than they and their family can consume. And so the ability to produce surpluses that could be used to support people doing other tasks other than farming, doing craft production, producing pottery, weaving textiles, making baskets, making stone tools, making metal tools. These people didn't have to work their own fields in order to feed themselves. They could trade the product of their labor for agricultural goods that were produced by other people. And it's not just that plants were domesticated, humans as a species were domesticated. We were no longer hunter-gatherers, following wild plants and animals' availability across the landscape, but rather we began to settle down. We became domesticated. And we needed new social institutions in order for these small groups that had formerly been independent and highly mobile to settle down and integrate and live next door to other groups and higher population densities. So it led to new social institutions in order to integrate these more diverse and larger populations. So this was an incredibly transformative change in the history of human societies, and it's important to understand the nature and timing of these changes. And we can look at morphological change, the measurable change in the size and shape of domesticated species, in order to measure when domestication occurred. Two different approaches are used to study domestication in archaeology, as is discussed by Bruce Smith in the article from Science that you are to read. There's the archaeological approach to recover specimens, often what we call macrofossils, that can be analyzed. And then the other approach is the biological approach, to look at the genetics of wild and domesticated species. And Smith talks about how these two approaches work very closely together in order to help define where plants were domesticated and how they spread from the initial center of domestication. The study of macrofossils, however, requires very good preservation conditions. Dry deposits, like in caves, or carbonized plant fragments, where the fragments have been burned and transformed into essentially small pieces of charcoal, but not crushed up and not turned into ash. So that is a unique condition, both dry deposits and the carbonization and lack of breakage and crushing of the plant fragments. Now, the representativeness of the samples that we recover of macrofossils is often biased by preservation conditions. It's not often that we find nice dry caves. Food processing behaviors. How were the foods used and how likely were they to be carbonized in a way that would allow them to be preserved? And also the characteristic of plants. Corn, because it is used as a dried kernel most of the time, is much more easily preserved than tubers like potatoes, which don't leave very many remains behind to be recovered archaeologically. The genetics of wild and domesticated species can be compared in order to identify where it was on the landscape that the center of initial domestication occurred. What wild plant populations have unique genetic markers that are still found in domesticated varieties? And Smith gives an overview of some of the ways that genetics have been used to identify the centers of corn and squash domestication. A new frontier in the analysis of domestication is other small particles that can be recovered archaeological and soil samples and analyzed. Things called phytoliths, which I'll show an example of in just a minute, starch molecules, and pollen. All of these are microscopic, and there is a greater chance of preservation than there is of plant macrofossils, things that you can see with your naked eye. Pollen and starches are often recovered in direct association with artifacts that were used to process foods. Phytoliths, phyto, plant, lith, stone, are rigid microscopic bodies often made of silica, the same material that sand is made out of, and they're found inside many plants. And they are what give plant cell walls their rigidity, and they are particularly found in grasses and allow grass stalks to have the rigidity that they have. And corn, maize, is a grass, and these are the phytolith forms that are found within maize cobs. So even after the maize cob decays, these small little rocks that were essentially inside the cell walls of the maize remain behind in the soil, and they are very small. That scale is 20 micrometers, 20 millionths of a meter. They have distinctive forms based upon the species that they come from, and specialized analysts can identify these from soil samples. The analysis of starch granules is an emerging field in the study of domestication, and is particularly useful for the study of some plants that don't preserve very well. In this example, we are looking at chili pepper starch granules. These starches occur in the walls of the plant, and when the plant decays, they can be preserved under certain conditions. So we have two rows, the wild row where we have very small starch molecules, and the domesticated row above where they are very large, and both modern and archaeological specimens. The larger the fruit, the chili pepper that contains the seeds within, the larger the starch granules. So increased size of the fruit, increased infructescence leads to larger starch granules, and this can be measured archaeologically. Pollen is another source of microscopic evidence, and when you find pollen of a plant outside its native range of distribution, you know that it was introduced by people and is likely a domesticated variety. So here's some manioc pollen that was recovered from Tabasco, Mexico. Now manioc is native to the Amazon basin far to the south in South America, and this pollen dates to 4600 BC, indicating that this domesticated plant was introduced from South America into Mexico that early. Many different varieties of plants were domesticated here in the Americas. The most important ones perhaps are corn and potatoes. But there are also many other plants that you recognize, like beans, squash, sweet potatoes, peanuts, chili peppers, cotton, tobacco. But there's also ones that you don't recognize perhaps, like marsh elder, maygrass, knotweed. And some of these were small-seeded plants that were domesticated in the eastern United States before corn was introduced from Mexico. And in the next unit, when we talk about the woodland to Mississippian transition, we'll see the key role that the introduction of corn had in the transformation of human societies of the eastern woodlands. Prior to the introduction of corn, people in the eastern woodlands grew several different varieties of wild, small-seeded plants that were domesticated to increase the size of the seeds. But they were still not as productive as corn, so when corn was introduced, they were rapidly replaced by corn. Marsh elder and many other plants that were domesticated are what are called disturbance species. They are plants that colonize areas that have been disturbed. Areas that have been disturbed by natural processes like fire, flood, erosion, or areas that have been disturbed by human activities of clearing land. So humans, as they moved across the landscape and settled in different areas and transformed small little islands within the environment, those small disturbed areas would attract these plants, and then people, as they came back to those points upon the landscape in their seasonal round, perhaps began to use these plants. And so we see a cycle where people could have been interacting with plants more intensively year after year, generation after generation, leading to their slow transformation. Sunflowers were another plant that was independently domesticated in eastern North America and continued to be grown and used after the introduction of corn, primarily because of the oils that it contained. Like with marsh elder, we can see the increase in the seed size in terms of the increase of the hull that holds the seed from the small wild variety to the archaeological and modern domesticated varieties. In the Foraging in the Southwest lecture, we talked about amaranth and goosefoot, and these are domesticated varieties of those small-seeded, weedy plants. Domestication was marked by increased seed size and also decreased dehiscence, where they don't shed the seeds easily, but rather hold on to them, making them easier to harvest. Amaranth is sometimes called red root pigweed, and some varieties of amaranth have selected for that red color. Some have very red stems, red flowers, and seed hulls. Some even the leaves are red. And the Hopi grew a variety of amaranth that had been selected for this red color, not to eat it, but in order to use it as a dye plant. So not all domesticated plants were used as foods. There's a lot of diversity in modern squash that you can go and buy at the store or the farmer's market, and a lot of this diversity is because squash was independently domesticated in several different locations, providing a lot of baseline genetic diversity that later people doing selective breeding had to work with in order to create these many different varieties of modern squash that we can use. From the evidence we now have at hand, it appears that squash might be one of the earliest domesticates. Evidence of its domestication is as early as 10,000 before present. This is from a site called Huila in Oaxaca, Mexico. Huila means white cliff in the Mixtec language, and it is a cave at the base of a tall white cliff. And in the center and on the left, you can see what are called the peduncle. It is that section of stem that joins to the fruit. And as the fruit gets larger, this gets larger. And these sections of stem often dried out while attached to the fruit after it was harvested and before it was used. And in dry cave environments, they are very well preserved. And so measuring the change in the size of the peduncle gives us an idea of the size of the fruit. And on the right, you can see a seed. And the seeds also change in size, becoming larger as the fruits that contain them become larger. There were several independent episodes of domestication of squash, genus Cucurbita. And as Smith discusses in the article, the domestication of Cucurbita pepo in the eastern woodlands was of a variety called subspecies ovifera, whereas the domestication of Cucurbita pepo in Mexico was a different subspecies, Cucurbita pepo pepo. And then the diversity of genes within these different populations of the early domesticates, once people began to exchange seeds between groups that had sources from these two different original stalks of plant, they could build upon this genetic diversity, creating the diversity of squashes that we have today. So pumpkin, zucchini, acorn squash, the yellow summer crookneck squash, those are all Cucurbita pepo. As different as pumpkin and zucchini seem, they are the same species. There's a separate center of domestication in western Mexico of a different species of Cucurbita, and these are cushaws. And in the earlier slide of the squash, cushaws have a crook neck but a weird little knobby body. There were also independent episodes of domestication of other species of Cucurbita in South America. In the northern part of South America, Cucurbita moschata, the butternut squash, was domesticated. Further down the coast, the black-seeded squash. And in the interior, in the upper headwaters of the Amazon, Cucurbita maxima, different banana and buttercup squashes, were domesticated. And you can find butternut, banana and buttercup squashes in the market today, but black-seeded squash is not something that is found in North American produce sections. There's a lot of variety in modern domesticated varieties of maize, and this is because many, many generations of selective breeding by humans in order to create different varieties that were suited to different elevations, different moisture or soil characteristics, different productivity in different ways. What colors they sometimes were deliberately selected for as well. And there are generally a few different varieties of corn, primarily flint corns, hard corns that are grown in order to make flour, and sweet corns that are grown in order to be consumed before they dry. The corn that you eat as corn on the cob, and most of the corn that you eat as cut corn that's frozen or canned, is all sweet corn. If you've ever had a corn on the cob that tasted real starchy and awful, someone passed off some flour corn as sweet corn. Maize derived from a wild grass that's found in southern Mexico called teosante. Now on the left you can see how these tiny little cobs of teosante can be seen as ancestral to modern cobs of corn. And here we see some teosante growing wild still today in southern Mexico. It is the grasses that you see in the foreground here. As I mentioned, mutations led to a change from 2-row, as you can see 2 on either side of a central stalk, to 8-row, as the 2-row mutated to 4-row, and then the 4-row was crossbred to create the 8-row, the maíz de ocho. Genetic evidence indicates the domestication occurred in the Balsas River Valley of southern Mexico using a subspecies Zea maiz parviglumis. And after people domesticated maize and began to move it other areas, either the people moving and bringing seeds with them, or trading the seeds to their neighbors and introducing them to agriculture. A northern domesticated variety appears to have crossbred with a highland subspecies, Zea maiz mexicanus. And this highland subspecies gave the new hybrid certain characteristics that increased its success at growing at higher elevations, with colder temperatures and shorter growing seasons. And this was key to allowing maize, a tropical grass, to expand its range via human propagation further north into North America, all the way up into southern Canada. The plant and cobs of teosante were much smaller than those that are found in modern varieties of corn. It's because humans have selected for more and more productive varieties of corn. Corn with larger cobs bearing more kernels, larger plants that bear more cobs, plants that are much more productive. And once you have domesticated plants, you are producing more food per acre than you would with wild plants. While we know that corn was originally domesticated from a variety that is found in the central Balsas River Valley, the site where we have the earliest macrofossil evidence of corn is to the south, at the same cave site of Gila Nikitz where the early evidence of squash domestication was recovered. And corn there dates to about 6300 BP. A little further north, in the Tehuacan Valley, there are sites where corn dates to as early as 5500 BP. And corn spread northwards, up into Tamaulipas and northern Mexico, where cave sites, corn has been recovered, dating to 4300 BP. And by 4200 BP, corn is present here in the American Southwest, being grown in irrigation systems down around Tucson, and also above the Mogollon Rim. But phytolith evidence suggests that corn is even earlier than the macrofossil evidence would suggest. Phytoliths recovered from the site of San Andreas on the Gulf Coast of Mexico were found in sediments that have been dated to about 7300 BP, more than 1500 years earlier than the earliest macrofossil evidence. And again, this is well outside the range of the wild plant from which corn was domesticated, which was found far to the west in the Rio Balsa River Valley. So a team of archaeologists decided to target the Rio Balsas River Valley and do a survey to try to identify sites that may preserve evidence of early corn use, and to excavate at those sites to recover samples to analyze and artifacts to analyze as well, using new methods of starch analysis. So here is a site, Jihua Toshla Shelter, and that's a Nahuatl word that I have not been able to find a translation for. But you can see where the people are, that narrow space beneath this rock that was formerly, thousands of years ago, more easily accessible and used as a shelter for early agriculturalists in the Rio Balsas Valley. And from deposits that date to around 8700 BP, even earlier than the phytolith evidence from Gulf coastal Mexico, we have these groundstone tools, and analysis revealed maize starch still adhering to them, since they had been used to grind and process the corn kernels. The spread of corn and its movement from its center of domestication to other areas can be studied through plant macrofossils, phytoliths, pollen, starches, but it also can be measured by proxy by looking for certain types of tools that were used to process these domesticates. So the movement of corn into the southwestern United States can be measured by a transformation in groundstone assemblages. Before the introduction of corn, which has hard, large corn kernels, they're using groundstone just to crush small seeds of wild plants like amaranth, goosefoot, and others. These are very small seeds that don't require a lot of effort in order to grind them up into a meal. In contrast, because corn kernels are so much harder and larger, they require more effort. And so we have an increased size of the surface area of the tools that are used to grind. The monos become much larger. Rather than a single one-handed mono, you have a larger two-handed mono. And rather than moving it around in a circular motion within a small basin, it's worked back and forth within a defined trough that contains the material that's to be processed, and you grind it over and over and over and over in order to transform large hard kernels of corn into fine corn meal. And so looking at the transformation of these tools can allow us to see when corn is introduced and becomes more important in the economies, even if we don't recover specimens of macrofossils or pollen or phytoliths or starch. There are a few people, however, who suggest that maize might have initially been domesticated not for the seeds, but rather the sugars that are in the stalk. Now, most of you may have chewed upon a stalk of some species of grass and it seemed rather sweet, because many grasses contain sugars within their stalk. Now, this sugary juice from the stalks of maize was used to make alcoholic beverages in some parts of Mexico. Now, the earliest varieties of maize were not very productive in terms of the amount of seeds that they were producing. It was the later mutations that increased cob size and grain yields. And the earliest evidence of maize in some areas lacks any carbonized seed grains. There's just pollen and phytoliths only, as though they may not have been using the seed grains, but rather just using the stalks. And here we see specimens of stalks from dried caves that have been chewed on in order to extract that sweet juice. The corn grain itself can be used to make beer, which is called tesuino. But you can also make an alcoholic beverage from the maize stalk juice. This map shows areas where maize stalk juice was made historically. And it's possible that maize was initially used in order to use these sugars within the stalks rather than the seeds. And the seeds were sort of a secondary thing that came later. There's a lot of diversity in modern domesticated bean varieties. Here we can see different kidney beans, dark red and light red kidney beans, different varieties of pinto, spotted beans, black beans, white beans. And one of the reasons there's a lot of diversity in modern domesticated beans is Like with squash, it was independently domesticated in different areas, providing a lot of genetic diversity in the early populations of domesticates that allowed people through selective breeding to create all of these different varieties. Beans are all genus Phaseolus, and the common bean, Phaseolus vulgaris, was independently domesticated in both North America and South America, and provides us with modern varieties that we know as pinto, kidney, white, black beans. The scarlet runner bean, which is a bean that grows along a vine, was independently domesticated in both North and South America. The tepary bean was independently domesticated in northern Mexico and southern Arizona, and it is from the tepary bean that the Autumn people got their name, the bean eaters or papagos, from the Spanish. And tepary is from their word for bean, which is tapawi. Phaseolus lunatus, the lima bean, was domesticated in South America, near what is now Lima, Peru. Beans grow in two different forms. You have what are referred to as pole beans, beans that grow on vines and climb up poles, as you can see on the left, and bush beans, beans that grow on bushes. Pole beans are sometimes grown intermixed with corn, and the corn stalks act as a scaffold that they can grow upon. Monocropping, growing a single plant in a field, is really a modern development of large-scale industrial farmer, and indigenous traditional farmers often grow plants together, and this is useful because some plants, like beans, help fix nitrogen in the soil, while corn pulls a lot of nitrogen out of the soil. So growing them together helps balance out some of these needs of the nutrient cycle. Some plants, knowledge about domestication is much harder to come by, and it's because the plants don't preserve very well. Potatoes and other tubers are an example of this. Potatoes were domesticated sometime between 8,000 and 4,000 BC in South America. We're not sure, and it's been largely by proxy, by looking at the types of tools that are present and how people might have been using them in order to process different foods, because tubers do not preserve very well, even in dry environments. But new advances in the starch analyses are likely to shed a lot of new light on the domestication of potatoes and other tubers. It's quite possible that different varieties of potato were independently domesticated in different parts of the Andes, because modern potatoes have a large number of varieties. We're most familiar with brown russet potatoes, yellow Yukon Gold potatoes, and red potatoes. But there are all different kinds. Here we can see some purple potatoes. And I've had potatoes from Peru that are not just purple skinned, but their flesh all the way through is a purplish color. Potatoes were domesticated in the Andes. They grow at high elevations and were an incredibly important crop for Andean peoples. Sweet potatoes were also domesticated in South America, and also, like potatoes, we don't know much about their domestication because of the poor preservation of these tubers, although it's likely that starch analyses are going to increasingly shed new light and provide more information about this process. Cassava or manioc is a root crop that was domesticated in the Amazon and spread northward into Mexico and the Caribbean, and has since spread across the Atlantic to Africa, where it is an important source of food. It is a crop that can be grown in marginal soils. It is highly drought tolerant, but it is unusual in that it contains cyanide, and it has to be prepared properly in order to remove the cyanide. And if it is not properly prepared, it can cause illness, nervous disorders, and even paralysis and death. How people figured out how to do this, I'm not sure. Likely a process of trial and error, and I really feel sorry for those who had the error. Chili peppers are my favorite vegetable, and can you imagine a diet without peppers? Imagine Thai food without peppers, because there were no peppers in any Asian cuisines until after 1492, and the contact between Europe and the New World that then led peppers to spread widely throughout the Old World. Peppers were also independently domesticated in different areas, providing a lot of genetic diversity that people have played with in order to create a lot of different varieties of peppers. And people still continue to play with in order to create new varieties of peppers that are even hotter and hotter than earlier varieties. However, the way that peppers are processed and consumed rarely leads to their preservation except for in unique dry environments that can preserve the stems, the seeds, and sometimes even whole fruits. The stems are important the same way that the peduncles of squash is, and that as the fruit grows larger, the size of the stem that attaches to the fruit grows larger. Also, the seeds grow larger as the fruit grows larger. But because processing of chili peppers rarely leads to the seeds being carbonized, they are not often recovered except for in dry cave settings. A study that integrated both macrofossil and newly collected starch evidence suggests the early presence of this domesticated condiment, because it's not something that is the center of the meal, but it's something that's used to make all other foods better. And it suggests the rapid development of very sophisticated complex of not just growing crops, but a cuisine, a way of integrating these different food plants into different types of foods. So chili peppers were domesticated as early as 6200 BP in coastal Ecuador and as early as 6000 BP in central Mexico. As I mentioned with the amaranth that was domesticated to create a red dye, there are some plants that were not domesticated in order to eat them. And cotton is one of these. Now the seeds of cotton are edible and do provide a useful oil. Cotton was primarily used for the fibers that it produces. And the selection that people have made to transform the wild plant into the domesticated variety was not to have bigger seeds, but rather to have longer fibers that could be transformed into threads and yarn and then woven into textiles. Cotton was independently domesticated in both the New World and the Old World, and in the New World it was independently domesticated in South America and in Mesoamerica, where two different species were domesticated. The South American variety, Gossypium barbadense, spread from South America into the Caribbean. Hence it is sometimes called sea island cotton, and this is the variety that was grown in the southeastern United States. The Mesoamerican variety, Gossypium hirsutum, spread northwards out of Mexico here into the southwestern United States, and varieties that are still grown commercially here are called Pima cotton, because it was a variety developed by the A'adam or Pima Indians. It is still a very favored variety because of the long fiber length that allows it to be transformed into excellent threads for textiles. Like cotton, tobacco was not domesticated for food. Rather, it was used as an intoxicant. It was initially domesticated in the eastern foothills of the Andes from a wild species like that one shown here. This domesticated variety was then spread by people throughout the Amazon, and then it naturally hybridized with other wild species within the Amazon. Then these new hybrid domesticate varieties spread to the Caribbean and into the eastern North America, where it again hybridized with different wild varieties. This Virginia tobacco, which was smoked by the first Europeans arriving in the eastern United States, is the ancestor of all modern domesticated tobacco that is grown worldwide. So if you see a pack of camels and it talks about fine domesticated Turkish tobacco, it was not domesticated in Turkey. all tobacco comes from the New World and was spread to the Old World by people after contact between Europeans and New World peoples.